Thank you very much for attending. Welcome everyone who is present. Um, Today's short info session and seminar is organized by the Masters in Public Administration at the Department of Politics and Governance at the University of Nicosia. It is a new program that we have launched, and it is beginning in September 2025. It's a program focused on public management and public administration. It blends together the best theories and practices, as well as it encourages from students original contributions and specializations, and it will give the students who undertake this program an opportunity to work as executives, managers, policy analysts in a wide spectrum of public services organizations, for example, national government, local government, NGOs, and the non-profit sector. So the program combines a number of courses on public administration, public management, public economics, political science, and law. So it is, although it is focusing on public administration, it is an interdisciplinary program in terms of the content covered in the course and in terms of the faculty teaching the courses in the program. We have organized this seminar to give a broad outlook on some of the issues and themes covered in the program, and to allow anyone who's interested to engage with us today through comments and questions at the end of each presentation. There will be two presentations, one by myself. My name is Giorgos Charalambous. I am an associate professor at the University of Nicosia, the Department of Politics and Governance. And I will speak about state institutions and their relationship to society in contemporary Europe. And the second presentation will be by Dr. Christina Ioannou, who's also an associate professor at the Department of Politics and Governance, and also the Vice Dean of the School of Law. So I will begin with my own presentation, then we can have a short interim period between the two presentations for any comments or questions on what I am going to present. Many of the issues and themes that are touched briefly upon in our presentations are elaborated in much more depth in the programs provided by the Department of Politics and Governance at the University of Nicosia, and more specifically, the program I mentioned at the beginning, which organizes this seminar, which is the Masters in Public Administration, and it is offered in both Greek and English. Let me share my, just 1 second, please. Let me share my presentation, and we can begin with that. Just give me 1 second, please. Here it is. So the main topic, the main idea behind the presentation is that we need to know, we need to be aware of the relationship between the state and society in contemporary Europe. And the idea is that on the one hand, we have formal state institutions, so the focusing is on parliaments, executives, and public administration, which pretty much delimit the main state institutions. And on the other side of the relationship, we have parties, social groups, and citizens, which are groups and themes when it as far as society is concerned, because society is not simply something loosely defined. We can zoom in on it and we can explain and discuss not only citizens as voters, but also parties as organized intermediaries between the state and society, and also civil society, organized social groups, whether NGOs or social movements or political parties. So state institutions are mechanisms of governance, lawmaking, and implementation, and society is made up of citizens, political parties, civil society organizations, and interest groups. And the question we will be addressing in this short presentation is how these entities interact, how they influence each other, and manage power in doing so. This is a crucial question because the past 10 years have seen many changes, both as regards state institutions and public administration, and in what concerns society at large, political party changes, and variability in terms of how and when and in what ways civil society organize. Sorry? Yeah. And also the past 2 decades or so has been a period of crisis. What many in the academic literature call a polycrisis or a permacrisis. In other words, a crisis with manifestations in a number of policy fields and domains: the environment, the economy, the climate, the humanitarian issue of refugees and immigrants, and so on. Let me begin with parliaments as a key political institution, and outline some of the challenges that they are facing in their that their relationship with society is facing, has been facing. First of all, in a recent time, many political scientists and sociologists have registered a rise in populist politics. Politics which simplify the political complexity of our world, which engage a lot in blame shifting, and which emphasize the distinction between the ordinary citizens and the corrupt elite. This kind of politics, which comes mostly, but not only, from the far right, it is something that can be also seen in the center of the political spectrum and on the left of the political spectrum, has been reducing parliamentary legitimacy. And more generally, we have been witnessing a decrease in public trust towards political institutions, such as parliaments, but also executives. Around only 30% of European citizens on average across countries trust parliament in their own state. And this obviously creates a legitimacy problem because people don't engage, don't engage a lot with parliaments beyond elections. They are perceived as inefficient or irrelevant compared to, for example, international organizations or economic elites. And also, in between elections, there is weak engagement with petitions, citizen assemblies, or consultation, and an over-reliance on local sectors or apparatuses for input. Therefore, we also have party loyalty overriding constituency interests. Therefore, sometimes parliaments operate on the basis of what party leaderships consider to be the right way forward, but this often presents itself at a disjunction with the interest of these parties' actual constituencies in societies. And it fuels dissatisfaction and a further decrease in public trust. There are a number of examples which we can mention that verify and validate these challenges that parliaments have been facing. For example, in the UK, the Brexit debates exposed many deep divisions in the House of Commons, and also between MPs and their constituents, and they raised also in the aftermath of Brexit many questions about parliamentary sovereignty and representation. In countries like Hungary and Poland, which we will come across again and again in this presentation, we have parliaments that have been criticized for passing laws too quickly, without sufficient debate and consultation with society, and a more general weakening of checks and balances for the state institutions. Indeed, the global trend that goes beyond Europe, but also includes many European countries, is that in many democracies, the legislative role of parliament has been declining as executives gain prominence. And when it comes to executives, we have two issues that have been affecting their relationship with citizens and society at large. First, the presidentialization of executive power. Even in parliamentary systems, in other words, ones that are not presidential, we have heads of governments, e.g. prime ministers, which increasingly dominate policy, public image, and party direction. There is also an increasing personalization of politics, whereby the persona of the leader matters more than the complete and multifaceted mechanism of executive office. So a lot of attention is given on the actual leaders, their charismas, and at the same time, these prime ministers, these presidents have accumulated a lot of power and increasingly dominate policy making. And again, some examples come from the UK with strong centralization under leaders like Boris Johnson or Tony Blair before. France, where the current president, Emmanuel Macron, exercises very strong control over parliamentary allies. And Hungary, where the Prime Minister Viktor Orban combines executive parliament with party control and blurs the separation of powers between parliament and the executive. Furthermore, there has been a strengthening of executive autonomy. So governments act with increasing autonomy from parliaments, especially during crises, whereby they use emergency powers, decrees, and fast-track legislation. All these tools, which signify the higher concentration of power in European political systems, have been increasingly used, especially during periods of time when there is turmoil, such as the financial crisis at the beginning of the 2010s, or more recently, the pandemic, the COVID-19 emergency. Again, there are examples from Europe and beyond. Italy, for example, in Italy there has been a frequent use of emergency decrees by prime ministers, and in Poland, especially under the previous government, executive bypassing the executive was largely bypassing legislative checks during judicial reform processes. Now, the problematic of the relationship between political institutions and societies has a second level of investigation and analysis, which concerns the relationship between parties and political institutions. And again, here we see a number of challenges that are creating new developments in Europe, relatively new developments. First, party fragmentation and volatility, because in many European party systems, there has been a decline of traditional parties from the center left and the center right, a rise of new, often populist and often extremist movements, such as the AfD in Germany. And because of these realignments in the party systems of European countries, we also have hung parliaments and unstable coalitions sometimes, which complicate governance. The classic example here is Belgium. Then, at the same time, parties themselves have lost a lot of legitimacy, because membership in traditional parties is at historic lows currently in most European countries. An example, one among many examples, is the Labour Party in the UK, which lost approximately 200,000 members between 2020 and 2023. Then there is over-professionalization of politics. Parties rely on career politicians and public financing, and there has been a decline of ideological engagement, which weakens the intermediary role that parties traditionally play as linkage providers between society and the state. So the more professionalized and the less ideological parties become, the bigger the problem of their intermediation between society and the state. They have lost a lot of this representation function that they, in theory and traditionally, occupied. Populism and anti-establishment movements obviously affect the relationship between parties and political institutions as well. And they create distrust of mainstream political institutions. And this distrust feeds back into the rise of outsider parties, such as the Lega Nord in Italy, Fidesz in Hungary, or the far-right party Vox in Spain, which is a relatively new arrival in Spanish party politics. Finally, in Europe, we have observed, especially during crisis period, the increasing relevance of technocratic governments. Governments formed by non-party experts or constrained by EU budgetary rules. And again, here, Italy is an example which had two technocratic governments in the past 10 years, the government of Monti and the government of Draghi. And we can also think of Greece with the Papadimos government during the years of the financial crisis back in the early and mid-2010s. So the relationship between political institutions and political parties in Europe is characterized by mutual dependency, structural stress, and also some innovation and adaptation, because many parties have responded to their abandonment by members and voters with electoral reform, citizen engagement efforts, and more generally an attempt to create more participatory channels through parties for citizens to engage with the policy-making process. Now, when we move to citizens and political institutions, again, we have a number of challenges that are similar but not the same. First of all, a decline of trust in institutions, parliaments, as I said before, but also executives and political parties. There has been an increasing anti-politics sentiment among European citizens, whereby citizens perceive politicians as distant or self-serving. And at this point in time, around 20 to 30% of EU citizens only express in relevant surveys, for example, the Eurobarometer surveys, trust in political parties. Secondly, political polarization, so the division into two deeply entrenched and competing political blocs weakens consensus-based governance and fuels even more populist narratives. And here, the result has been the rise of the far right. Again, an example is the AfD in Germany, which is important because recently, as a note in parentheses, the German state categorized AfD as an extremist anti-democratic party, yet it has been attracting all the more support from voters. And it had a few victories recently in regional elections in Germany, and generally it has been growing in terms of popularity. And this is partly a result of political polarization. Thirdly, excuse me again, there are turnout disparities. Youth and marginalized groups often vote less than the rest of the population. And despite high online engagement, we have the empirical literature has observed a generally low youth turnout in various national elections. And finally, some governments have eroded checks and balances, and this is called democratic backsliding because democracy is losing some of its fundamental aspects, and it is losing a lot of its quality as well. Again, here, the two most talked about examples are Poland and Hungary, where judiciary capture, media control, and weakened parliaments have created a situation of a very low or lower than before quality of democracy. And part of this democratic backsliding process, which again is not only a European phenomenon, but a global phenomenon, and it comes hand in hand with the global rise of authoritarian leaders across the board, is also encompasses the increasing policing and criminalization of protests. Because as institutions are losing trust from citizens, citizens tend to go into the streets much more frequently and voice their complaints. And therefore, in the past 10 years, we have seen a large number of mass protests in various European countries and for several issues which governments have responded to by tightening their control over citizens through increasing policing, the policing of protest, and through taking to justice, sometimes arbitrarily, many protesters. So far, we have talked about political institutions and society, and the second aspect is public administration and political and society. As regards public administration and political parties, we've had again public trust erosion, reduced policy stability, in various countries clientelism and partisan appointments, but also policy volatility with party change. In other words, one party, when it's in government, implements certain policies, and as soon as the government changes partisan composition, then that policy is reversed. This is something that we have seen frequently in Greece. However, there are other examples as well. In Hungary, the Fidesz party has embedded party loyalists in civil service. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party, which was governing until recently, undermines the neutrality of judiciary and administrative independence. In Italy, frequent coalition changes lead to policy instability. And in the UK, the civil service has been increasingly under strain after Brexit from partisan political pressure. So, at the same time, when we talk about public administration, we have to note that there is a growing NGO involvement in policy making. So, for example, in Greece, NGOs have filled state welfare gaps during debt and the humanitarian refugee crisis. And this means that a lot of public administration work has been outsourced to civil society and the private sector. At the same time, digital advocacy and civic tech tools have been increasingly used by both states and civil society organizations, but in certain countries, there have emerged regulatory restrictions on NGOs. Actually, one example is Cyprus itself, where there has been a more authoritarian response to civil society, to NGOs operating in the country. But the most talked about again example is Hungary, where foreign-funded NGOs have faced a lot of government hostility. And this has led to various regulatory restrictions on NGOs. Some countries diverge from this path because they have an institutionalized dialogue between social partners. So, for example, in Germany, there is an institutionalized union-state dialogue via corporatism, and in Sweden, there is a strong collaborative welfare NGOs integrated with administration. So public administration adopts a hybrid character whereby both the state and welfare NGOs that collaborate closely with the state have been taking action. At the same time, public administration has become increasingly digitalized. Open governance and digital governance have been very popular approaches to public administration in the past 10 years or so, because they are thought to enhance transparency and participation by citizens, and to make it easier for citizens and civil society to interact with civil society services and agencies. However, there is a digital divide between those parts of the population that can very well and they are very adept in handling digital access to public services, and on the other hand, those parts of the population that may lack digital access or literacy. Older adults, rural residents, and migrants are three such groups. And here the positive example is Estonia, which is thought to be a model type of digitalized public service. And on the negative side, we have Romania and Bulgaria, which lack in e-government uptake, and where digital literacy among the population remains uneven. Also, public administration and its relationship with citizens is challenged by bureaucratic complexity, especially in countries such as Italy and Greece, where there is a reputation for red tape and slow administrative processes. Thirdly, public administration faces the question of accountability and responsiveness, which also has to do with austerity. Citizens feel ignored or underserved by public institutions, and many European countries restructured public administration to cut costs and increase efficiency, as under the influence of new public management and EU budgetary rules, and this has cut back welfare, social policy, and other state services provided to citizens, and creates an even bigger problem of accountability and responsiveness under conditions of austere public sectors. For example, in Greece, Portugal, and Spain in the 2010s, there has been a merging of agencies or services to reduce redundancy, as well as a reduction in public employment, often through a freeze on new jobs in the public sector. Finally, public administration faces some language and cultural barriers in its relationship with citizens. Minorities and migrants often face exclusion from mainstream services, and this is something that becomes a problem because of the lack sometimes of multilingual support in online government portals, or the absence of civic outreach in several EU countries. To conclude this brief presentation, and we can take up any of these points during the discussion now or later, we have four main developments. First of all, in the relationship between state institutions and society. First of all, a crisis of legitimacy. In many democracies, states and their institutions appear less able to respond and be accountable towards citizens. Secondly, there are governance gaps in addressing complex issues such as inequality, which has not really improved in recent years after the crisis, and issues such as the climate. Thirdly, populist backlash and democratic backsliding, undermining institutional norms and fueling even further the crisis of legitimacy. And finally, a contradiction or a tension better between centralized authority and participatory demands on the side of society. Now, in this short presentation, we don't have the time to go into proposed solutions for these trends, for these challenges, for these developments, for these democratic deficits. But this is something, of course, we can discuss during the Q&A. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my presentation now. I think I have stopped. Yes, I have stopped sharing it. I think now we could take a few questions, if there are any. There is a question by Maria. Can we say that these two groups are independent, or does society determine state institutions? Yes, the main way through which society determines state institutions is obviously elections. However, although there is an interdependency between society and state institutions, their relationship can be very close, very interactive, or it can reveal a democratic deficit whereby political institutions are insulated from the input of citizens. So although according to democratic theory, these two groups are interdependent because institutions arise on the basis of election results and are occupied by people who are elected in office, both parliament and the executive, the actual process of interaction between them can take such a shape and such a form that there is very little legitimacy for state institutions as understood by citizens. So yes, they are interdependent on election day. However, in between elections, the two can drift apart, if you like, if there is a lot of concentration of power, a lot of authoritarianism, a lack of transparency and accountability, and so on. I hope this has addressed Maria's question. There, yes. What David is asking, what accounts for the rise of right-wing populist political parties in the democratic West, and why do their ideologies gain popularity and support? In the academic literature on far-right parties, there are various factors that have been identified as catalytic in the popularity and electoral rise of such parties. Some of these factors I have already mentioned in the presentation. So, for example, the lack of satisfaction and public trust in mainstream parties and mainstream institutions. Also, the normalization of the far right, because when the far right emerges, it is competing with other parties on the center right. And these center right parties often emulate, they copy their far right competitors in order to avert the loss of votes in that direction. But this has been found to create the opposite effect. The more you normalize extremist actors, the more they become popular and more powerful. However, an exhaustive answer to your question would include many other parameters of political systems and society, such as austerity, such as propaganda on immigration, such as the lack of capability by left-wing parties to challenge the right and win over a large part of the vote, such as electoral opportunities, the electoral system, for example. Different electoral systems have a different impact on the far right. So it's a large range of factors, and sometimes in addressing them, we distinguish between supply side and demand side factors. The supply side factors are what these parties offer, what they say, and why what they offer, what they supply the electoral arena has gained popularity, and demand-side factors are focusing mostly on citizens and how citizens with certain attitudes respond to changes in European party systems and abandon mainstream center-right parties to vote for the far right. A lot of this has to do with democratic backsliding, because democratic backsliding removes a large part of the legitimacy of current political systems and fuels protest and anti-establishment votes, and even the extremist vote as well. I think this is the short and the long story cut short to David's question. There is indeed an abundant literature on right-wing populism, on far-right extremism, and of course, anyone who would like to delve deeper into this literature, you can email me and I can send you any further reading for your own benefit. Okay. Any other questions, or maybe you want to keep some questions for the end when Dr. Ioannou also finishes her presentation? I don't see any other questions. So, dear Christina, I'll give the floor to you for your own presentation.
Thank you very much. Let me try and share my screen. Yeah. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. So I will take a more social dimension and speaking about a topic that sits at the very heart of the European project, which is the European Pillar of Social Rights, and why it matters more than ever today, shaping the future of social Europe. So what I want to consider today with you is how public administration is essentially the engine of social Europe. So let me start by defining this European pillar of social right. What is this pillar? So starting with the basics, the pillar was proclaimed in 2017 by the European Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. And it outlines basically 20 essential rights and principles that are grouped under 3 pillars. The equal opportunities and access to the labor market, the fair working conditions, and social protection and inclusion. Plus, there are also the cross-cutting sectors that affect all 3 chapters. So the European Pillar of Social Rights essentially touches on a wide range of interconnected policy sectors, all of which contribute to the goal of a fair and inclusive Europe. So I will start with presenting to you the first of these pillars, which is the equal opportunities and access to the labor market pillar. So the policy sectors that are mainly included here are education and training, including early childhood education, primary and secondary education, higher education, and lifelong learning, gender equality, non-discrimination and equal treatment, labor market activation, for example, active labor market policies, public employment services, and so on, support for people with disabilities, as well as youth employment and integration. The second pillar, which encompasses fair working conditions, includes policy sector such as employment and labor law, which encompasses fair wages, secure employment contracts, and protection in case of dismissals, work-life balance, parental leave, flexible working arrangements, for instance, as well as occupational health and safety, social dialogue and workers' participation, working conditions on digital platforms, and working time and rest periods. And the pillar on social protection and inclusion includes sectors such as social protection systems, minimum income, access to health care, child and family support, long-term care and support for the elderly, inclusion of people with disabilities, housing as well as homelessness, and access to essential services such as energy, transport, digital connectivity, and even very basic services such as water. We also have, of course, access to health care, also inclusion of the inclusion of people with disabilities, as I said before. And finally, we have the cross-cutting sectors, which, as I said before, are those that affect all three chapters, that may include migration and integration policies, digital transition and skills, green transition and just transition, fiscal and macroeconomic policy as shaped through the European semester, which I will talk about in a few minutes, and regional policy and cohesion funds. Now, let's consider now why this pillar, this social pillar, is relevant, why it matters. We can say that the challenges that we face today, a lot of the challenges that we face today, from digitalization and climate change to geopolitical shocks and demographic shifts, all of them demand solutions that are socially just, socially fair. And what this pillar attempts to do is ensure that economic transitions are fair, that people are protected, that growth goes hand in hand with inclusion. Then, in other words, that these are not just left to be dealt with without the social element being embedded into them. As we have very recently seen, when we experience the impact of of this already in the EU's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As we've seen its impact on the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis. I mean, many times this idea, this basically fairness and social, let me say, elements are sometimes ignored. Measures like the SURE measure, the recovery funds, have reflected the spirit of this pillar, that is essentially to prioritize people rather than anything else. So let's have a look at what has been achieved.
Christina,
Ne?
I'm sorry to interrupt. The presentation doesn't change slides.
Oh,
We
really?
still have the third slide.
Oh, let me see why. Okay, I'm trying to, have I stopped sharing now?
Yes, now you have stopped sharing. If you could share again and go to the current slide, that would be great.
I'm changing them. I don't know why it doesn't show.
Maybe the university can help us.
Let me share again.
Do not click on slideshow, because if you click slideshow, I think that's why.
Now you can see the screen, my screen.
First slide at the moment.
We can see slide 3.
Okay, so you haven't seen.
Now it changed.
Yes, I was changing it, but it wasn't for some reason changing. Maybe it's because I had it full screen. I don't know. So I could just maybe repeat a few of the things that I said. I explained the pillar, what the European pillar of social rights is. I mentioned the 3 different pillars, and for each one, I went into detail explaining what policy sectors is include. This is the first pillar on equal opportunities and access to the labor market, and underneath the policy sectors that it includes, which I mentioned before, basically. This is the second pillar, the fair working conditions. Underneath, you can see all the policy sectors that it includes. Again, labor market mainly, work-life balance, health and safety at work, social dialogue, working conditions, working time, rest periods. And this is the third pillar, basically, that includes social protection and inclusion policy sectors that again, you can see on this pillar, social protection systems, including pensions, health insurance, and employment benefits, as well as minimum income, access to healthcare, child and family support, long-term care and support for the elderly, inclusion of people with disabilities, housing and homelessness, access to essential services like energy, transport, digital connectivity, and water. And finally, here you can see the cross-cutting sectors that affect all 3 chapters, which include migration and integration policies, digital transition and skills, green transition and just transition, fiscal and macroeconomic policy as shaped through the European semester that I will be talking about, as well as regional policy and cohesion funds. Then I went into wide matters, and I think this was the last slide that I had on before I stopped, which basically is all about why the social pillar is relevant, why it matters. And as I said today, we face a lot of challenges, from challenges such as digitalization, climate change, to geopolitical shocks, to demographic shifts. And all of these problems, all of these challenges demand solutions, but they demand solutions that are socially just. In other words, people have to be taken into consideration. And what this pillar aims to ensure is that economic transitions are fair, that people are protected, that growth goes hand in hand with social inclusion. And obviously, we have so many examples that we can look at, and in all these examples we can take into account and we can consider the extent to which the social dimension has been taken into account or has been ignored, for example. And measures such as the recovery funds of the European Union do reflect many times the spirit of the social pillar that aims to prioritize people. Now, let's just take a look at what some achievements so far have been, what has been achieved so far. First of all, at the Porto Social Summit back in 2021, policymakers came up with some targets, what are known as the 2030 targets. So these are targets aimed to be achieved by 2030, in other words. For example, aims such as 75% employment rate, like reaching that rate, a 60% adult training participation is also one of them. Goals, targets, and lowering the risk of poverty by 15 million. So these are the main targets set back in the Porto Social Summit, the 2030 targets. We have also seen in the last years some major initiatives. For example, we have seen a directive on adequate minimum wages. We have seen the work-life balance directive, the European Child Guarantee and Youth Guarantee, and the new proposals on platform work and minimum income. So these have been some real tangible steps that have been taken. But of course, we can always say on the downside that implementation remains uneven among the member states. So indeed, there are many challenges still ahead of us. So despite some gains, we have a lot of challenges that remain. Obviously, inequalities persist between regions, between generations, between social groups. Inequalities are there. We also have precarious and non-standard work being on the rise. I mean, this is something that we do experience in many, many countries. Also, access to housing, childcare, and social protection remains limited for many, especially for the self-employed and for gig workers. And one thing that we must remember is that the pillar itself is not legally binding, and its impact relies rather on political will, on funding, and on coordination. So obviously, all these challenges are there. They exist. They're pretty rigid. So these are still obstacles that need to be overcome. So what is the way forward? Where do we go from here? One thing that we need, first of all, is stronger enforcement. So monitoring is not enough, especially on issues like fair wages, education access, and social protection. Second, we must use EU funds more efficiently and more effectively as well. Aligning instruments like the European Social Fund Plus and Just Transition Fund with the pillars priorities. They should be linked, the priorities with these funds. Third, we need social conditionality, so making EU funding dependent on dependent and not just on economic targets, but also on social outcomes. So this is something that a connection that could be made that could work much more efficiently if, let's say, we get there. And finally, we can say that everyone must be at the table, from social partners and civil society to cities and regions. So subsidiarity is important as well. So inclusion must be in principle in both policy and process. So let's take a look now at public administration and how public administration obviously is the engine at the end of the day of social growth. We've seen, this is a pillar that sets out principles that reflect Europe's commitment to fairness, to opportunity, to social justice. But it's important to also understand that principles are only as powerful as the systems that bring them to life. So that's where public administration comes in. We can't have vision without delivery. And delivery at the end of the day depends on public administrations. So the European Pillar of Social Rights is not just a list of aspirations. It is a framework for ensuring that every person in the EU enjoys access to social protection, to education, to fair working conditions, and essential services. But while the European level can set direction and provide funding, it is public administrations at national, regional, and local levels that at the end of the day design the policies, implement the programs, deliver the services, and uphold the rights. So without these effective, modern, and inclusive public administrations, the goals of the social pillar will remain out of reach. So it is at the end of the day about delivering, as I said, social rights. It is a public sector mission delivering these rights. So let's consider a few examples. When we talk about unemployment support, who handles it? It's public agencies. Early childhood education or adult upskilling, who manages it? It's education ministries and local authorities. Another example, access to affordable housing or healthcare, who handles it? It's public bodies that are designed, that design these frameworks that provide, at the end of the day, the service themselves. So in this way, public administration is the frontline actor in the fight against inequality and in the fight against social exclusion. This is something that is also visible in the European Union's governing tools. We have, for example, the European Social Semester and the Recovery and Resilience Facility that link the social pillar to national reform and investment plans. So the European semester process, or just the semester as it's known, is an annual, basically year-long mandatory process that coordinates, that monitors and evaluates at the end of the day member states' economic, fiscal and social employment, environmental, energy and climate policies, reforms and investments. But drafting and implementing this plan, all of these plans, once again, it falls squarely on public administrations. So again, that requires more than just compliance, because it demands capacity, it demands coordination, and also it demands a culture of evidence-based policy making. And this is all up to the public sector, the public administrations. Now, to meet these demands, public administrations themselves must evolve. So modernization is important, inclusion is important. And in this context, digitalization, for example, is key. Of course, it must be people-centered, ensuring that no one is excluded. Citizen participation is also vital in policy design, in monitoring, and in feedback loops. And above all, public servants must be empowered, resourced, and trained to take on this expanded, let me say, social mission. So at the end of the day, we need administrations that reflect the values of the social pillar in how they operate. So they must operate with transparency, quality, fairness, and accessibility. And finally, it's all about, once again, a right-based approach to governance. So it is also important to remember, in other words, that the social pillar is not just a policy vision, but it is about rights at the end of the day. So it's the right to education, it's the right to minimum income, it's the right to fair working conditions. And public administrations are the duty bearers in this equation. So they're the ones that must ensure that these rights are real, that they are enforceable, that they are accessible to everyone, regardless of gender, background, or socioeconomic status. So inclusion is important. So at the end of the day, this means not just delivering services, but enabling legal certainty, access to remedies, and administrative justice. So at the end of the day, principles, as I said in the beginning of this slide, are only as powerful as the systems that bring them to life. And this is how and why public administrations are important. So to conclude, we could say that the European Pillar of Social Rights is more than a policy framework. It is a moral compass. And because I consider this very, very important, seeing it in this dimension, let me close by saying this. The European Pillar of Social Rights is essentially a vision of what Europe should stand for: dignity, solidarity, and opportunity for all. But its access does not rest on legislation alone. It also rests on strength, on integrity, and capacity of public administration institutions. So it rests on civil servants, on policymakers who bridge this gap between, or should bridge this gap between principle and practice. So if we want, at the end of the day, to build a truly social Europe, we must invest not only in our people, but also in the public institutions that serve the people. Thank you very much. I would be very happy to take questions if you have any questions.
Yes, let's hear if there are any questions for Dr. Ioannou.
I'm David. Thank you for the presentation. I found it really helpful. Just had a question. Wouldn't COVID-19, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, aging population, all these factors affect the goals that are to be met by 2030?
You mean how they affected the social pillars?
For example, take aging population, right, in Europe. More old people and fewer young people basically means labor shortages, and this makes hitting the 78% employment tough for Europe.
Yes.
So I'm just concerned with like EU's fiscal policies and the aging population, all these factors. Will they affect the goals set by Europe to be achieved by 2030?
Okay, let me try and answer it as briefly as possible, this question. I would say that, sorry, just a question. Have I stopped sharing? Is it my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I would say that, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic had a very significant impact on the European Union's ability to meet the 2030 targets that are set under this pillar. Because while, let me also give you the hopeful aspect of this before I break it down. While, however, it has created setbacks that I will mention in a minute, it has also, at the end of the day, accelerated policy action and increased awareness on social vulnerability. So that's, let me say, on the plus size. So I could say that, let me take, for example, first of all, the aspect of employment. What has been the impact of COVID-19? So in 2020, for example, employment rates dropped sharply throughout the EU due to lockdowns and economic disruption. And what we did see is young people and those in precarious jobs being hit the hardest. And the employment rate fell in 2020, and it actually fell under the target that was set for the year. Now, as far as recovery is concerned, we had the EU-wide recovery efforts that included SURE. SURE is the support to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency that essentially prevented mass layoffs. We also have, by 2021, we did see employment rates beginning to rise again. And even though disparities among the member states persist, especially between South and Eastern Europe, Southeast and North-South and Eastern Europe as well. Now, as far as training is concerned, like having percentages of people that participate in training every year, once again, We did see the impact of COVID-19, like the pandemic highlighted the need for digital and green skills, but it also exposed gaps in adult education access, like we had training programs being disrupted, especially for low-skilled and older workers. We also had a pretty interesting indication of what we call the digital divide, and the lack of access to online tools that left many people behind, and that's how the divide actually mattered there. And in the context of recovery and in the context of acceleration post-pandemic, we did see some EU initiatives like the Reskill and Upskill initiatives and the Digital Education Action Plan, as well as the national recovery plans that have placed renewed emphasis on adult learning. And we have also seen many employers and public services shifting to online training models. And all of these are continuing, of course, post-pandemic. So we did have an upskilling, a very considerable, let me say, upskilling. Now, going to the target of poverty reduction, of reducing, let's say, the risk of poverty, that target, I would say that the impact of COVID-19 hasn't been, hopefully did cause a very sharp increase in poverty risks, especially for low-income households, for migrants, for single parent families. And I would say that in the immediate post-pandemic era, millions more people are at the risk of poverty or social inclusion. I mean, we did experience a sharp increase. Now, on the recovery aspect, and mitigation, let me say, what we have seen as a response is emergency income supports, job retention schemes, housing protections that temporarily, I would say, cushioned this impact. And we have also seen the Recovery and Resilience Facility that tried to prioritize inclusion. But again, even its medium-term effects are uncertain. So I don't think I can talk in a very hopeful manner about that. So I would say that without the actual structural reforms and more targeted investments on poverty risks, the goal of reducing poverty by the level suggested in the 2030 targets is in very serious jeopardy. I don't think it's something that is achievable personally. So I would say that this is the one that I believe is the least likely to achieve. However, just to be hopeful once again, let's keep the positive legacy of the COVID pandemic. We have seen some greater recognition of essential services. We have seen digital transformation, as I said before, both of public services, but also of education. And there has been, let me say, to an extent, a renewed focus on resilient welfare systems. So I would put these things on the plus aspects of the pandemic. So this as far as the COVID question is concerned. As far as the war in Ukraine, that was also included in the question that you asked, I would say that, of course, now I mean, it began back in February 2022. I would say that that had significant effects, both direct and indirect, on the European Union's progress towards the 2030 targets. And of course, while the war is primarily a geopolitical crisis, its social and economic repercussions have very deeply influenced employment, education, and poverty trends all across Europe. I would say that as far as employment is concerned, we have seen energy shocks, inflation, economic uncertainty that had really put a lot of pressure on the labor markets. Because the war did lead to an energy crisis, we had supply chain disruptions, a slowing down of growth that was very much linked with a business uncertainty, particularly in industry-heavy economies. And we have also seen a lot of sectors such as manufacturing, transport, seeing a lot of temporary contractions and employment levels being significantly at risk. I would say that we did see in many countries labor markets remaining more resilient than in other countries. However, I would say that also new challenges were created with the influx of refugees as well from Ukraine. So I'm not. I don't think. I think it has disrupted the employment target of the pillar. However, we can't say that it's totally condemned the target. It might still be achievable. It does depend on also future economic stability. And so I would keep, let me say, a question mark there. Now, as far as training is concerned, like the target that wants adult participation in training, I would say that the war has accelerated the EU's, let me say, push for more strategic autonomy, for green transition, and it has increased demand for energy-related skills, for example, in renewables. Digital competencies that I mentioned before, as well as skills for humanitarian support. And the countries have also faced the challenge of integrating a lot of refugees and providing language training, integrating these people into education systems. So I would say that there is a momentum for training, but there are significant gaps in capacities. And also social inequalities still limit access to training, especially for the vulnerable groups. And lastly, for the poverty target, the poverty reduction, in other words, what the impact of war, well, obviously, I mean, it goes without saying that the war caused a major inflation spike across the EU, particularly in energy and food prices, and in housing and transport costs. And obviously, this has hit more severely the low-income groups, the vulnerable households that were hit the hardest by this. And it has pushed more people towards poverty and social exclusion. Well, many governments have responded with emergency subsidies, some price caps, and some support packages. But again, on a very temporary basis. I wouldn't say it's on a permanent basis, this. And And as far as the impact on refugees is concerned, the refugees have been faced with a lot of housing insecurity, with income instability. They are a very vulnerable group with unequal access to services in the host countries that they go to. So I would say that the current status of this is a worsening of the poverty trends, especially in the countries of Europe that have weak social protection systems. So again, my conclusion is that the poverty target is the most at risk, I would say. So yeah, that would be my response to your question. I'm not sure if I answered it completely or if you still have follow-up questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, you did.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Are there any other questions that I could?
Yeah.
I'm
If
not
there are
sure if
no
there.
other questions,
Let me check the chat, Jorgen, 1 minute. The chat.
I'm looking at the chat. Yeah.
There. Sorry, I didn't have it open. So yeah. Okay, I don't see any questions.
Maybe myself and Dr. Ioannou can note our emails, and if you want to reach for any further information, either about today's presentations or about the programs the department offers, feel free to do so. So let me note my own email in this chat, and Dr. Ioannou can do the same. So here you go. Sorry. Wrong. Okay. Okay, here you go. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you to everyone for listening and engaging with us today. We really hope it was useful for you, and we'll be doing these info sessions and seminars again after September. We'll do more. So, keep alert if you are interested.
Thank you very much as well for bearing with us.
Have a nice holiday. Have a nice rest of the day. And again, feel free to reach out if you want to discuss anything further.
Goodbye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.